All right, I'm here with Andrew Kung. Andrew Kung is a Brooklyn-based artist who specializes in photography, whose work visualizes the Asian American experience. Andrew, how are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
All right. Our first question is going to be, how would you describe your work to someone who's never seen it before?
Yeah. So I think my work is kind of works across different genres. So it's not necessarily just documentary work or fashion work or editorial work, but I think it combines a lot of these different genres, and it centers on kind of contested ideas of place, identity, and belonging. So I often draw a lot on like my personal experiences, to kind of subvert both like the male gaze and also kind of challenge kind of the stereotypes of Asian Americans, and kind of what it means to belong in America. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of, again, a lot of young men, oftentimes they see masculinity as like a goal, something they need to aspire to be. And so they turn to like a lot of these online streamers, content creators, maybe politicians, to kind of help them define themselves in their goals of masculinity. So do you feel like your artwork kind of pushes against that?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that's essentially one of the goals. It's like not only for people striving to like learn or experience a bit more of like what masculinity means, but also using that as a form of like education or inspiration for like even like outside of just like masculinity, but how like Asian Americans are kind of like perceived as well. So I think there's like many different goals of like photography or like subject matter that I'm like kind of curious to dive into, like masculinity being one of them. Like the opera, where a lot of the male leads are in like full makeup and singing in really high pitches. That as an expression of masculinity versus like what we've kind of made in the Hudson, where you and your brother are wrestling on the train tracks, or you and Walter are kind of in a water kind of scene, in the river, or in the creek. So like those are all the different types of kind of expressions that I'm trying to delve into that really kind of both tackle the masculinity element, but also like the Americanist element, the belonging element. So I think those are all the kind of ambitions that I think I have with all these projects.
Yeah. Actually, to talk about your different projects, your series, the All-American, Dreamland on the Hudson, and Perpetual Foreigner, they all kind of explore Asian American identity in relation to specific spaces and environments. So I was wondering how you chose spaces and environments for your projects.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think well, a lot of the projects that you mentioned, a lot of them take places in slightly, depending on like the kind of objective of the project. Like the All-American, a lot of it was like looking at interior spaces, that where I've often felt excluded, or a lot of other kind of Asian Americans or Asian American men have felt excluded. But it's like, how do I place that subject in that kind of interior space as a form of like planting a stake, but also saying that they're like evoking a sense of like comfort and belonging.
Yeah.
Whereas, in the Hudson, it's so like site specific to the Hudson Valley, that all the kind of locations are cast like along the river. And I think that is so important because the Hudson was considered America's first iconic landscape. It was considered one of the first subject matters of like the early painters who came here. And so that is such an instrumental piece that is a subject in itself when you look at the pictures. It's not just the people who inhabit the space, but it's also like the space and nature itself.
Yeah.
And then lastly is like Perpetual Foreigner. Like that really challenged a lot of different kind of spaces that Asian Americans haven't really been seen in a very American context. So all of this was like very like outdoors nature. So like white picket fences, picnics at the park, like these are all very quintessentially American things.
Yeah.
That really haven't seen kind of Asian American presence in, essentially.
Our next question is, I was wondering if you could talk about what you're currently working on. I know you mentioned the opera piece, and what future projects you're excited about, and what themes and ideas you're most interested in exploring in your future work.
So I think the Hudson work I'm really interested in. but I'm also really interested in these like different communities. So I think the Hudson work is a lot more of like I'm kind of constructing a scene and really scouting those locations. But I think I'm really interested in like also just diving into like actual communities that live here in New York that have like really rich stories and traditions that they carry on. And I want to document that. And I think that informs both my Hudson work and vice versa, because the Hudson work is a bit more controlled. The work where I'm like documenting kind of communities is like less controlled, right? I have to like react to a lot of environments. I just kind of have to sit there and observe. And I think that makes me better in kind of both ways. And so I think those are the things that I'm really excited about these days. And I think wrapped up in all those stories are like themes of like Asian histories and traditions and how it's like represented here in America, and kind of this element of like belonging in an American both landscape but also in an American setting like New York City, seeing opera or stuff like lion dance, where you really see these like underground kind of communities express their traditions on the streets of America, which I think is so beautiful as well. So yeah, there's definitely some elements of like masculinity, Americanness, and all that kind of tied into these projects, no matter how it's kind of expressed, whether it's a bit more controlled or it's a bit more like documentary.
We got to get wrapped up real quick, but one more question. I was wondering if you had any advice. This is on any advice for individuals who want to use photography to kind of raise awareness or fight for a certain like political cause.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one thing that I guess recommend is really kind of tapping into like the personal of like why, of like why is a subject matter or a community or a topic really interesting. And I think the more you think about that from a personal lens or experience, the more both excited you will be, but the more like in depth you'll get about that subject matter. Because I think there's a huge personal element to any of these projects. Like when I think about the Hudson work or like the work in the communities, like for me to actually make really good pictures, it has to really mean something for me as like a photographer or as an artist. And I think a lot of people sometimes just kind of make the work because they think it might get views or might get likes or it might go viral or something like that, which I think is a byproduct of like really strong personal work that you make because you're really inherently curious or interested in it. So I feel like the advice I would give is just like tapping into like both personal experiences and just like researching and exposing yourself to like a lot of different content and stories to see if there are things that like really kind of pique your interest. And if there are, then like diving into why that might be and maybe a form of expression, whether it be a photographic way or film, would I guess be the next step in kind of taking that to life.